was adopted by a white missionary couple.
I was adopted.
Immediately placed for adoption.
I was in foster care with one family for 18 years. They were white.
My parents loved us, and I understand that, but at the same time,
they took the idea that they were saving me.
Saving us from ourselves.
Being saved, and I should be grateful for the life that I've been given, because any child on the reservation would give anything to live as I was living.
They took us away from our mom. They came marching right in and literally took us and thousands of other children from their home.
It's a way to eradicate us. And to go to a nation's children is one of the sure ways to do that.
The U.S. has a long and brutal legacy of attempting to eradicate Native Americans. For centuries, they colonized Native American lands and murdered their populations. They forced them west and pushed them into small, confined patches of land. But Native Americans resisted. A Board of Indian Commissioners report said, instead of dying out under the light and contact of civilization, the Indian population is steadily increasing. And that was an obstacle to total American expansion. So the U.S. found a new solution: to absorb and assimilate them. It all started with an experiment and a man named Richard Henry Pratt.
He had in his charge some prisoners of war, and he taught these men how to speak English, how to read and write, and how to do labor. He dressed them in military uniforms and basically ran an assimilation experiment. And then he took his results to the federal government and said, they're capable of being civilized. So he was able to get this project funded.
In 1879, the government funded Pratt's project, the first ever off-reservation boarding school for Native American children. His motto was to kill the Indian and save the man. What started there at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School was nothing short of genocide, disguised as American education. Children were forcibly taken from reservations and placed into the school, hundreds, even thousands of miles away from their families. They were stripped of their traditional clothing, their hair was cut short. They were given new names and forbidden from speaking their native languages.
To take our children and to indoctrinate them into Western society, to take away their identity as Indigenous peoples, their tribal identity. I think it's one of the most effective and insidious ways that the U.S. did do harm to Indigenous peoples here, because it targeted our children, our most vulnerable. And they tried to make us ashamed for being Indian, and they tried to make us something other than Indian.
There are also accounts of mental, physical, and sexual abuse, of forced manual labor, neglect, starvation, and death.
My great-grandfather went to Carlisle, and nobody in my family ever talked about it. So if you Google Indian boarding schools, the majority of the pictures that you will see will be actually from Carlisle. Colonel Pratt created propaganda. He hired a photographer to create those before and after photos to show that his experiment was working. So it was, intentional propaganda.
And it worked. The Carlisle model of education swept the country and led to the creation of over 350 boarding schools to assimilate Native American children.
On the one hand, we have the Navajo as we find him in the desert. Few of these boys and girls have ever seen a white man. Yet, through the agencies of the government, they are being rapidly brought from their state of comparative savagery and barbarism to one of civilization.
In 1900, there were about 20,000 Native American children in these schools. By 1925, that number more than tripled. Families that refused to send their kids to these schools faced consequences like incarceration at Alcatraz or the withholding of food rations. Some parents who did lose their children to these schools even camped outside to be close to them. many students ran away. Some found ways to hold on to their languages and cultures. Others, though, could no longer communicate with family members. And some never returned home at all. By stripping the children of their Native American identities, the U.S. government had found a way to disconnect them from their lands. And that was part of the U.S. strategy. During the same era in which thousands of children were sent away to boarding schools, a number of U.S. policies infringed on their tribal lands back home. In less than 5 decades, 2/3 of Native American lands had been taken away.
The whole thing was purposeful. And the fact that it has been buried in the history books and not acknowledged is also intentional. And in fact, the same tactics were used in New Zealand, Australia, Canada. All of these countries have acknowledged, apologized, or reconciled in some way, except for the United States.
Over time, the brutality of boarding schools started to surface. And after a 1928 report detailed the horrific conditions at some schools, many began to close. In the 1960s, Indigenous activism rose alongside the civil rights movement. And by the 1970s, that activism forced more schools to shut down. The government handed over control of the remaining boarding schools to tribes to be run in partnership with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But just as the boarding school era started fading, another assimilation project took shape: adoption. The main goal of this pilot project was to stimulate the adoption of American Indian children to primarily non-Indian adoptive homes. They claimed it was to promote the adoption of the forgotten child, but it was essentially a continuation of the boarding school assimilation tactics. And the strategy came with a financial advantage for the government too. Adoption was cheaper than running boarding schools. But first, adoption officials had to sell white America on the idea of adopting Native American children. Feature stories like this one in Good Housekeeping marketed them to white families. They were described as unwanted, and adoption gave them a chance at new lives. In the end, their media campaign worked. White families wanted Indian adoption. But the problem was, many of these children were not orphans that nobody wanted. They were kids often ripped apart from families that wanted to keep them.
You still will hear stories today of people, my age, older, saying, I remember as a child, the social worker was coming and people would hide their children.
On reservations, social workers used catch-all phrases like child neglect or unfit parenting as evidence for removal. But their criteria was often questionable. Some accounts describe children being taken away for living with too many family members in the same household.
An extended family is a big thing for Native people, and that means being judged for being in a house that's overcrowded. So it's always whiteness is the standard for success, and everything else is judged by that standard.
By the 1960s, about 1 in 4 Native children were living apart from their families. The official Indian Adoption Project placed 395 Native American children into mostly white homes, but it was just one of many in an era of Native American adoptions. Other state agencies and private religious organizations began increasingly making placements for Native American children too.
My mother giving me up was a white person telling her if she didn't, she would never see her other kids again.
In one of the documents I have, it's addressed to my biological father, Victor Fox, that he was trying to look us up to get a hold of us. But Hennepin County wrote, Daniel and Douglas are adapting very well in their new family. Just was totally, it was a false statement.
When you're adopted, you know you're missing something. I think I've likened it to having when someone has a 500-piece puzzle and they have all the pieces to make this pretty picture except one.
My adoptive mother was not well, verbally, physically, and sexually, and spiritually abusive. So by the By the time I was 14, I started drinking. 15, drugs were added, and I became an addict to numb. I didn't realize I was numbing pain.
I tried suicide, tried slicing my wrist one time.
Children were taken and believed like I believed for a long time that there was something wrong with me versus something wrong with the system.
The Indian Adoption Project was considered a success by the people who set it in motion. Officials claimed, generally speaking, we believe the Indian people have accepted the adoption of their children by Caucasian families and have been pleased to learn the protection afforded these children. But the truth was unsettling.
These hearings on Indian children's welfare is now in session.
Well, I was pregnant with Bobby, and the welfare kept coming over there and asking me if I'd give him up for adoption.
Before he was even born?
Yeah.
They picked up my children and placed them in a foster home. And I think that they were abused in a foster home.
4 years after Native people organized in this Senate hearing, Congress passed the Indian Child Welfare Act, known as ICWA.
It gives tribes a place at the table in court.
States would be required to provide services to families to prevent removal of an Indian child. And in case removal was necessary, they would have to try to keep the child with extended family or another Native American family.
Without our relatives, we cease to exist. So with Native people, part of our wealth is in our family. It's in who we're connected to.
But the legacy of family separation in Native communities has been difficult to fully undo. Today, Native American children are 4 times more likely to be placed in foster care than white children, even when their families have similar presenting problems. In these cases, ICWA is often the best legal protection they have, and it's been under attack repeatedly.
A young girl ripped from her foster family because of the Indian Children Welfare Act.
White adoptive families intent on keeping Native American children have tried to do away with the act, and they're often backed by conservative organizations.
The Indian Child Welfare Act was dealt a blow earlier this month.
The subject of a lawsuit issued on Tuesday by the Goldwater Institute, arguing that preferences given to American Indian families to adopt Indian children is unconstitutional and discriminates based on race.
It's a way for these industries, these very powerful industries, to try to attack what Indian identity is.
Wanting to overturn ICWA is connected to everything about who we are as a nation. So if we don't have any protections for our families, and if we don't have protections for our treaties, then we have no more Indians.
We've been under attack, we're gonna continue to be under attack. And we have to just keep fighting.
It's in our DNA to survive.
We are nations that pre-exist European contact, and we are still here.
Everything we know about Carmelita Torres is from a few newspaper accounts in 1917. They called her an auburn-haired Amazon, just 17 years old. She led angry women in anti-American rioting and shut down the US-Mexico border. But hidden within her story is something much bigger than a single riot. It's a story about American paranoia at the border, about a toxic campaign of disinfection and discrimination, and a US practice that would go on to inspire Nazi scientists. At the border between El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, thousands of people cross back and forth for work and school every day. They line up in Juarez and often wait for hours to get through the US checkpoint. But the border didn't always look like this.
Crossing this border used to be free and unrestricted. People would come and go without a passport. But after 1917, Juarez and El Paso became 2 separate communities.
It was a turbulent year at the border. The Mexican Revolution was ongoing, and the U.S. was about to enter World War I.
All of a sudden, you have the war hysteria created by World War I. People here in El Paso that are deadly afraid that the Germans are going to attack from Ciudad Juarez.
The fear of invasion brought tensions to the border, while across the U.S., a different movement was gaining strength. The Eugenics movement, based on junk science, aimed to create a genetically and morally superior population. That meant stricter controls on immigration, only allowing those deemed fit to enter. On Ellis Island, one of the busiest ports of entry at the time, U.S. health officials were tasked with weeding out immigrants they thought were unfit or disease carriers. And across the country, that process coincided with the stereotyping of Mexicans as inferior and unclean. Dozens of film titles included the word greaser, a derogatory term used to describe Mexicans. This racist sentiment was strong at the U.S.-Mexico border. El Paso's mayor, Tom Lee, had developed an obsession with cleanliness, and it defined his political platform.
This obsession with not only racial purity, but physical purity. He was going to literally clean up El Paso from all these bad elements. And by bad elements, he often meant racially bad elements.
One of Mayor Lee's biggest fears was a disease called typhus, spread by lice. So, under the pretense of sanitary betterment work, he helped lead a campaign to inspect every house in a predominantly Mexican neighborhood. If the inspectors found lice, occupants were forced to take vinegar and kerosene baths, have their heads shaved, and clothing burned. Hundreds of homes were eventually destroyed. Lee also expanded the supposed health measures to include inmates in the El Paso jail.
They had to strip naked, take a bath inside a tub full of kerosene, and on one occasion, it seems somebody lit a match.
27 prisoners, majority Mexican or Mexican American, burned to death in the fire that the newspapers called the jail Holocaust. But despite the tragic fire, Mayor Lee pushed forward with even more aggressive plans.
He sends a telegram, a Western Union telegram, to Rupert Blue, who was the Surgeon General up in Washington, D.C. And basically, well, let me just read it. Hundreds dirty, lousy, destitute Mexicans arriving at El Paso daily will undoubtedly bring and spread typhus unless a quarantine is placed at once.
The government didn't agree to a full quarantine because evidence suggested that typhus wasn't a major threat in the air disinfection plant at the border in 1916. In this facility, every immigrant considered a second-class citizen had to strip naked. Their clothes were sent to a large steam dryer and then fumigated with toxic pesticides inside the gas room. An inspector would check each person's body, including private parts, for lice. If they found lice, immigrants would have to shave their head and body hair and bathe in a mix of kerosene and vinegar. Some even had their eyelids checked for things like pink eye, and many had to complete puzzles or simple IQ tests to prove that they were fit for entry. After this process, they'd receive a ticket as proof that they were disinfected, but they would need to go through this every 8 days in order to re-enter the U.S.
So many people didn't speak about it. They didn't talk about this humiliating process, like they kind of internalized it. It's that psychology of shame.
The toxic baths and dehumanizing inspections at the border set the stage for a revolt, led by the 17-year-old maid from Juarez who defied the order to bathe.
Carmelita Torres I've compared her to the Rosa Parks of the border. In the morning of January 28th, 1917, there's this electric trolley full of mostly women that are crossing every day. She convinces the majority, if not all, the women in that trolley to just say no and to refuse. They start a spontaneous protest.
There are accounts that in addition to the humiliating delousing procedures, for women, there was also sexual humiliation.
There were rumors that, when they entered the plant and then they were told to strip, officers were taking their photos and then posting them in bars. So I can't even imagine the kind of feeling, like the feelings of violation and the feelings of, outrage.
She was called an instigator, a ringleader, but she was just a young woman that was just sick of the injustice, of the humiliation that other women had gone through.
What started with just 200 protesters that morning slowly grew to a crowd of 2,000. Reporters said the scene reminded one of bees swarming. The hands of the feminine mob would claw at the tops of the passing cars. When the American officers tried to disperse the crowd, they were met with bottles, rocks, and insults. Protesters even laid down on the tracks in front of the trolley cars to create a blockade. They were joined by men in what's called the Bath Riots, and they shut down this border for 2 days.
And then all you hear is that the ringleaders are arrested, and a few of the men are publicly executed.
As for Carmelita Torres,
it appears like she was thrown in prison, and as historians, we don't know what happened to her afterwards. We've lost every trace.
The fumigations didn't stop after the riots. In 1917 alone, over 100,000 Mexicans were deloused at the border. That same year, an immigration law made border procedures even more rigid. Immigrants at all points of entry needed to have a passport, take a literacy test, and many would have to pay an $8 head tax. And later that year, the U.S. Public Health Service laid down instructions for border agents about who should be kept out of the country.
Imbeciles, idiots, feeble-minded persons, physical defectives, persons afflicted with loathsome or dangerous contagious diseases.
The discriminatory policies at the border resembled horrific events elsewhere in the world. In fact, while researching this, David stumbled upon a detail. The fumigation of Mexican immigrants wasn't just reminiscent of Nazi Germany, it was directly linked to it.
It's not so much that the United States was copying Nazi Germany, it's the opposite. Nazi Germany was copying the United States.
He found that in the 1920s, the US started using Zyklon B, an extremely poisonous acid gas, to fumigate clothing at the border. And in 1937, in a German pest science journal, a scientist called for the use of Zyklon B in Nazi disinfection chambers. He included 2 photos of El Paso's delousing chambers as an example of how effective Zyklon B had been at the US border to kill unwanted pests. The same scientist pushed to use it to disinfect concentration camps, and eventually it was used in concentrated doses to murder millions of people.
People, rightly so, say you can't compare what happened in Nazi Germany with other parts of the world. And that's true. In terms of Zyklon B, it was used on the border not to intentionally kill Mexican border crossers. But the history of something like the Holocaust doesn't take place in a vacuum.
A few decades after the Bath Riots, Mexico started sending men to work on U.S. farms and railroads as part of a new labor agreement called the Bracero Program. And through the program, the border disinfections continued.
Here in this facility, some migrants were sprayed with insecticides.
This time, it was a substance called DDT,
Dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane,
a toxic pesticide which decades later would be banned for agricultural use by most developed countries.
Repeated contact must be avoided.
They were sprayed in the face, they were sprayed in their private parts, and they were stripped naked and inspected. And sometimes they're inspected like you would inspect livestock.
First-hand accounts from immigrants in the program reveal how little they knew about the fumigations.
So they talk about how humiliating it was, about why do they think we're so dirty? They all call it the white powder. I don't know if they necessarily were told we're spraying you with DDT, but they'll call it polvo, the powder.
A miraculous white powder that is helping to win the war against disease.
Many of the employees who worked in the facilities weren't given many details either.
When I first started, my role was a clerk. I got the job mainly because I spoke Spanish. There was a hut in the area when they came in from the Mexican side that they were going there, and they had some sort of, it was for lice, they said. It was, to disinfect for lice. And we never gave it much thought, but we did think, that's sort of like what the Nazis used to do, to the Jews.
I had heard during lunch breaks that they would spray them, and sometimes there were comments from the men themselves that they would put a hose to them. I don't know if they knew what they were doing to them. I certainly didn't know, it was far-fetched from the world we lived in.
It wasn't until the 1960s, when the Bracero program ended, that health authorities acknowledged the chemicals were dangerous and the baths and fumigations were finally discontinued.
You want history to be about progress, about everybody realizes how horrible it is, and then it stops. Unfortunately, that's how it works in movies, but this was the border, right? And in the border, a lot of things never become resolved. They just keep on repeating themselves.
Decades after the disinfection campaign ended, the language, the strategy, and the dehumanizing politics of fear and exclusion still linger.
It's a health issue, too, because we don't know what people have coming in here.
They're coming in with diseases such as smallpox and leprosy and TB that are going to infect our people in the United States.
It's just a fact. You're going to see disease outbreak.
Apprehensions in the El Paso area specifically have spiked more than 600%.
They are essentially being warehoused, as many as 300 children in a cell.
Without adequate food, water, and sanitation.
The United States is running concentration camps on our southern border.
I don't like anything compared to the Holocaust.
But why can't you compare it, his practices, to what led up to the Holocaust? Do we have to wait for the actual Holocaust before we speak out?
At the border between Juarez and El Paso, the same space where the bath riots once happened, hundreds of migrants have been huddled in makeshift detention centers. They've been waiting to find out if the U.S. government deems them fit for entry.
As always, there's so much information that we couldn't fit in this video, but I wanted to leave you guys with one last bit of information from David Romo's book. So in 1918, the southern border region was hit with its worst epidemic in history. And it wasn't typhus, it was the Spanish flu. The best evidence we have suggests it was actually from Kansas, brought to the border by American soldiers. Just wanted to leave you guys that tidbit. Thanks for watching, and I can't wait to share more episodes of Missing Chapter soon.
The president of America's Planned Parenthood Federation maintains that European women should stop having babies for the next 10 years.
But Mrs. Slee, in this country, having babies is the only thing left which is both unrationed and untaxed. Do you think we really ought to stop?
Well, I suppose a subject like that is really so personal that it's entirely up to the parents to decide. But from my view, I believe that there should be no more babies.
The term eugenics is basically a set of beliefs and practices that aim to improve the genetic quality of a human population. Historically, by excluding people and groups judged to be inferior and promoting those judged to be superior. There have been various applications of eugenics, perhaps the most famous being the Germans before and during World War II, which was condemned by the Nuremberg war crimes trials. But the Germans did not invent eugenics. In fact, they were inspired by the founder of the taxpayer-funded Planned Parenthood. The truth behind the genesis of that organization and its founder are much darker than most Americans realize. Who was the real Margaret Sanger? Why was she heralded by the Third Reich as the greatest socialist in America? Why do modern Democrats who claim to support the African American population justify presenting her as a cultural icon? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, a veteran of the United States Army and Marine Corps, former history professor, book author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. Margaret Sanger was born on September 14, 1879 in Corning, New York. She is an icon to left-wing groups due to her founding of Planned Parenthood in October 1916 with her sister Ethel Byrne and Fanny Amendel, which was the first birth control clinic in Brownsville, Brooklyn, New York. 9 days later, the police raided the clinic and arrested all the people involved for promoting birth control, which was illegal. Sanger refused to pay the fine and spent 30 days in jail. She then traveled the country preaching her concepts. Sanger then founded the American Birth Control League in 1921. Sanger also endorsed the 1927 decision Buck v. Bell, in which the Supreme Court ruled that states could forcibly sterilize people deemed unfit without their consent and sometimes without their knowledge. This American law would be the major defense at Nuremberg for the Nazi defendants who were doctors practicing Sanger's methods, and many would be found not guilty as a result of this defense. In 1939, Sanger began what was called the Negro Project, alongside black leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary McLeod Bethune, and Reverend Adam Clayton Powell. This was the plan to have black doctors performing on black patients, to perpetuate the sterilization of blacks who were deemed inferior, as many black patients were suspicious of white doctors. Following upon Sanger's eugenics platform, disguised as giving women access to birth control, the ABCL became Planned Parenthood Federation of America in 1942 after birth control was no longer considered illegal, at least among married couples. During this period, Sanger had critics and supporters. The supporters even today claim that she condemned abortion, arguing that it would not be needed if every woman had access to birth control. What they leave out is that Sanger only opposed abortions if that meant not producing the best, healthiest, most intelligent from Caucasian couples. For blacks, Jews, and brown-skinned people, as well as low IQ white people and those with birth defects, they were not to be allowed. This was what the Nazis adopted. Ironically, in 1966, Planned Parenthood began issuing its Margaret Sanger Awards annually to honor individuals of distinction in recognition of excellence and leadership in furthering reproductive health and reproductive rights. However, the organization very quietly and without any fanfare stopped this practice as Black Lives Matter rose to prominence. It would have been seen as the height of hypocrisy to have a liberal-backed domestic terror group that attacked white America connected to Sanger, a Democrat darling who wanted to exterminate blacks. In fact, the last recipient of the award listed on the website is Dr. Willie Parker in 2015. Then it just quietly disappeared. Parker was an abortionist known for his contentious claims that his Christian faith influenced his work. He was accused of sexual assault in 2019, which he denied, but he still resigned from all of his professional positions in 2020. Other recipients of the Margaret Sanger Award include House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and actresses Jane Fonda and Katharine Hepburn. Margaret Sanger was one of the few women to be given an honorific title and inducted into the Ku Klux Klan, and exalted by none other than Adolf Hitler and Dr. Joseph Goebbels. She was friends with the racist Democratic President Woodrow Wilson, Democratic fundraiser and automobile maker Henry Ford, who was also friends with Adolf Hitler, and a rabid anti-Semite and hater of black Americans. Margaret Sanger's rabid racism, anti-Semitism, and violent suggestions on eliminating all non-whites from American society endeared her to the eugenics crowd. She wanted an all-white, healthy, intelligent society built upon the concept of racial eradication years before Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party were even a thought. In 1934, the Nazi Party adopted her radical positions, with Goebbels saying, "Margaret Sanger is the best National Socialist in America." In fact, the September 15, 1935 Nuremberg laws classified races according to an insane chart drafted by Dr. Wilhelm Stuckart and Dr. Friedrich Kritzinger. The official name was the Reich Citizenship Law and the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor. These laws embodied many of the racial theories underpinning Nazi ideology, which they adapted from Margaret Sanger. These laws could provide the legal framework for the systematic persecution of Jews in Germany, who, at that time, were deemed a race and not a religion, and the eugenics behind them were taken from the world of Sanger. In fact, her theories and opinions influenced men like SS Captain Dr. Josef Mengele, the Beast of Auschwitz, and his associates, Dr. Karl Klauberg, Dr. Hertha Oberhäuser, Hitler's personal physician Dr. Karl Brandt, just to name a few. When Hitler authorized the Action T4 euthanasia program to murder the handicapped, mentally ill, and other undesirables from German society, the doctors and nurses were given the program directly from Margaret Sanger's own philosophy. On August 18, 1939, the Reich Ministry of the Interior circulated a decree requiring all physicians, nurses, and midwives to report newborn infants and children under the age of 3 who showed signs of severe mental or physical disability. The man who started the program was Dr. Karl Brandt, and they were disguised as children's clinics and advertised that they would treat their abnormalities and infirmities. In fact, they were death centers, where the children were quietly killed and the cause of death misrepresented as by other means, such as pneumonia, tuberculosis, etc. Dr. Brandt himself claimed that Sanger's methods were most effective and, if performed correctly, are ingenious. In Sanger's own words, she peddled racism, eugenics, contraception, abortion, while demonstrating a visceral hatred for children, parenthood, marriage, and the Catholic Church. The following quotes are directly from Margaret Sanger's own writings and interviews. Does to one of its infant members is to kill it. 2. A marriage license shall in itself give husband and wife only the right to a common household and not the right of parenthood. 3. All of our problems are the result of overbreeding among the working class. Knowledge of birth control is essentially moral. Its general, though prudent, practice must lead to a higher individuality and ultimately to a cleaner race. 4. Blacks, soldiers, and Jews are a menace to the human race. 5. The masses of Negroes, particularly in the South, still breed carelessly and disastrously, with the result that the increase among Negroes, even more than among whites, is from that portion of the population least intelligent and fit. 6. Birth control appeals to the advanced radical because it is calculated to undermine the authority of the Christian churches. I look forward to seeing humanity free someday of the tyranny of Christianity, no less than capitalism. 7. Every single case of inherited defect, every malformed child, every congenitally tainted human being brought into this world is of infinite importance to that poor individual. But it is scarcely less important to the rest of us and to all of our children who must pay in one way or another for these biological and racial mistakes. 8. It now remains for the United States government to set a sensible example to the world by offering a bonus or a yearly pension to all obviously unfit parents who allow themselves to be sterilized by harmless and scientific means. Margaret Sanger, the woman heralded by the Democrats and left-wing ideologues in the United States for her positions on women's reproductive rights, always failed to include her genocidal positions on ethnic cleansing. She died on September 6, 1966 in Tucson, Arizona. But Margaret Sanger was not alone. The late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said in a New York Times interview, "Frankly, I had thought that at the time Roe was decided, there was concern about population growth, and particularly growth in populations that we don't want to have too many of." In Elle magazine, Ginsburg also stated that poor people should have ready access to abortions because it makes no sense as a national policy to promote birth only among poor people. In 2015, out of $1.29 billion in total revenue, $553.7 million came from the government reimbursing Planned Parenthood for their services. In 2020, Planned Parenthood performed 383,460 abortions, the highest number of abortions it has yet reported, and an increase of nearly 28,600 from the previous year. And in the United States, the abortion rate for black women is almost 5 times that for white women. In July 2020, Planned Parenthood quietly removed Margaret Sanger's name from its headquarters in Manhattan, New York. Obviously, the times had caught up with Margaret Sanger. Thank you for watching Forgotten History. Please click like, subscribe, and share. Send us comments and show ideas, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Until next time.